My father asked me to take on the responsibility of my stepsister's college expenses, promising to pay me back later. However, years passed, and when I needed the funds for my wedding, he refused on the grounds that he could not accept my fiancée. I am 33 years old, but my relationship with my family has always been unstable. I tried to understand my family, and I believe my parents did the same, but we could not create a comfortable home environment. My parents divorced when I was 10 years old. At that time, I felt relief rather than sadness, as living together was never peaceful, especially for a sensitive child. The constant arguments and shouting in a problematic household are still stuck in my memory. From my childhood, I was often forced to mediate and resolve conflicts between my parents, reluctantly leading them to discussions or attempting to solve problems. On overwhelming days, I would not go straight home from school but seek refuge at my nearby paternal grandparents' house. The time spent with my grandparents was my only solace, as they cared for me deeply, making their home a sanctuary for me. My grandparents did interfere with my parents' issues, but after realizing it was futile, they told my parents not to burden me with adult problems. However, their advice was not heeded. Still, at that time, I did not realize that the role I was bearing was different from other children's roles. It felt like an unavoidable responsibility, and I did not see it as something special. The thought that other children were not performing such roles never occurred to me. When my parents divorced, I felt a sense of relief and stability. I moved between my parents' homes every few weeks, experiencing personal growth for the first time. The absence of shouting and conflicts allowed me to spend calm time with one parent at a time. These peaceful moments were precious and comfortable for me. I could feel my parents' love, spend my time freely, and engage in activities I enjoyed. I was particularly grateful that after the divorce, my parents never spoke ill of each other in front of me. Despite their complex emotions, they did not impose them on me. They might have vented their feelings elsewhere, but they were considerate in their interactions with me. I remember the constant hostility and conflicts in the house ceasing the moment my mother left. When I was 15, my father remarried a woman named Susan. I have built a very good relationship with my stepmother, Susan, which I cherish deeply. She is a wonderful person, and I have never harbored any negative feelings towards her. Although it was challenging to build a relationship initially, I believe we adapted well overall. However, the challenge arose when Susan married my father, as her daughter, Julia, was only 7 years old at the time. To be honest, Julia was somewhat self-centered. My father tried to maintain peace in the house by fulfilling Julia's desires. Even when Julia irritated or provoked me, my father always defended her, saying, "She is just a small child trying to adapt to a new environment, and you should respond calmly as an adult." For example, when Julia moved in, she treated my entire room as her own and took it over. While Julia was expected to live in that house for a long time, I was only there half of the month and planned to leave for college in a few years. Consequently, I was asked to give up my room, but I was not easily convinced. I did not want to relinquish my space or share a room with a much younger child. Eventually, my father proposed that Julia and I share the same room as the best solution. Susan then intervened in the situation. Whether she wanted to protect her daughter from her much older stepsister, me, or avoid worsening our relationship, I was unsure. However, she stated that it was unreasonable to take my room away and suggested that Julia should get another room. Ultimately, my father's decision not to rearrange the rooms was not due to my wishes but was influenced by Susan's strong suggestion. Witnessing my father disregard my opinion and follow his new wife's made me feel a strange sense of change in our relationship. Staying at my father's house was painful, not because of his new wife or her daughter, but because of my father's attitude, which made me feel alienated. However, I continued to visit because Susan treated me with genuine care. She took a real interest in my life, made an effort to spend time with me, and cooked my favorite meals during my stay. While my father seemed indifferent, Susan appeared to be my support. I kept my distance from Julia as much as possible since she was often complainant, and Susan never forced me to get along with her daughter. 3 years later, when I went to college, my father and Susan had another child named Emma, who is now 15 years old. Due to our age difference, Emma and I have not developed a close relationship. Strictly speaking, we are a family, but I do not feel we are connected by heart. When Emma was born, my father called me to say, "We can't afford it, so you'll have to manage the college expenses on your own." This was a shocking event for me. My father had been saving for my college education, enough to cover it without loans. However, when he reneged on his promise, my mother increased her support to minimize the loans I needed to take. Nonetheless, I ended up with some debt, but managed to secure a job after graduation that paid enough to cover the repayments. This incident created an irreparable rift between my father and me. The money that was supposed to be used for me was diverted for his new family. Afterward, I rarely visited my father's house and almost lost contact with him. Surprisingly, I still maintain a connection with Susan and Julia. To my father, it seems he hardly noticed my absence, probably because he had new children to care for. For about 7 years, I almost had no contact with my father. During that time, I graduated from college, moved cities, and even lived abroad for a year. Around the age of 25, my father suddenly contacted me, initiating a light conversation. I sensed he had an ulterior motive, not just small talk. Then he revealed that Emma had faced a medical emergency a few months ago. I was already aware of the situation through Susan and had been inquiring about it occasionally. I knew it had caused them a significant financial strain. Susan had savings set aside for Julia's college expenses, but my father used all of it for Emma's medical costs without telling her. He asked me to help with Julia's tuition and promised to repay me once things settled. I did not want to help my father. I wanted him to fully face the consequences of his actions. So I told him, "You have disappointed me." I had hoped he would make better choices for Julia, but he did not. "You told me to manage my own college expenses, and now you're doing the same to Julia. Moreover, you used the money saved for her without permission," I told my father. I added, "I managed with loans, so Julia can do the same," but he denied that, saying she could not get loans. Her biological father's support could not be expected to match what my mother had done for me, complicating the situation. I was prepared to help Julia. She had grown into a kind-hearted young woman, and I was glad to maintain a relationship with her. I called my father again, stating my conditions for helping. He must be honest with Susan and promise repayment. He did not want to involve Susan, but I told him I would not support him unless he was honest with her. After our call ended, I thought that was the end of the conversation. However, 3 days later, Susan called me, tearfully expressing her deep gratitude for what I had done. I had offered my support. My father had asked me to pass the tuition money to him, but since I did not trust him, I said I would give it directly to Julia instead. Julia agreed with this arrangement and later expressed her gratitude over the phone. Our relationship improved after that. But then the real problem began. I was engaged to Omar, who was originally from Afghanistan but grew up in the States, just like me. This displeased my father, who openly opposed it. I did not care about his background. I have not had a functional relationship with my father anyways. My mother and Susan liked Omar, and because Julia was close to me, the important people in my life all had a good impression of him. That was what mattered to me. We were preparing for our wedding, and I went to my father to ask for the tuition money I lent Julia. I told him that I needed the payment immediately because I planned to use the money for the wedding. My father argued that if Julia did not pay him, he would not give me a cent. Despite his opposition, I told him I was going to marry him. I informed my father that how I used the money was none of his business, and he had no right to threaten me. The repayment was rightfully mine, and even if it was used for my wedding, it had nothing to do with him. He had no right to interfere with my decisions. I might have not been able to fully convey how angry I was. There were heated exchanges, and I eventually decided not to invite him to the wedding. I also hinted at revealing his betrayal to his family and acquaintances, though he probably did not take me seriously at the time. Instead of exploding in anger, I decided to tell my close ones about his betrayal. I decided to send a detailed explanation of how he stole from Julia. I had prepared the funds necessary for Emma's upbringing, after which he came to me for help, promising to repay me. However, he quickly retracted that promise when it became convenient for him not to repay. The content was too lengthy to detail here, but that was the main event. I sent this message to my mother, Susan, Julia, my paternal grandparents, and my father's sister and her family. I did not send it to Emma. She was still a child, and I felt she should not be involved in this matter. I was not looking for a major reaction to my message. Honestly, I did this to vent my frustration and anger. And since I was able to cover the wedding expenses myself, I felt I might have gone a bit too far. Nevertheless, it was a significant decision, and now I am truly glad I did it, because now everyone knows how terrible a person my father is. The day after I sent the message, I received a call from my paternal grandfather. We exchanged usual greetings at first, but he quickly got to the point, asking if what I had sent was true and if I had actually helped my father with Julia's tuition. I confirmed that it was true and that I had lent a considerable amount to my father. Then he asked if all the money was used for Emma, and I answered that it was. My grandfather began to express his opinion. When Emma became ill, my father had hastily called him, explaining that he was facing financial difficulties and did not know how to handle Emma's medical expenses. He said he had Julia's college funds available but could not access them, so he could not use them for Emma. I interrupted him, informing my grandfather that, in fact, my father had full control over those funds and had used the money without consulting Susan. I also mentioned that Susan needed to be informed about the fact that my father had depleted Julia's money. From this conversation, I understood that Julia's money had not been used for Emma's medical expenses. This was because my grandfather had paid all of Emma's medical bills, and he was assured that the money would be returned. Julia's college funds had been taken care of by my father for another undisclosed reason, and Susan had known about my father's actions and contacted me. After hanging up the phone, I felt sick, as if surrounded by fraudsters and traitors, unable to trust anyone. I felt as if my wedding had been ruined because all these problems were too overwhelming, especially just before starting a new chapter of my life. I called my mother and confided everything to her. She encouraged me, saying that I should no longer involve myself in this futile matter and that we could resolve these disputes later. I said that since I am marrying a wonderful man, ensuring that no one ruins this important moment is what he and I can do now. My mother said there would be plenty of time later to blame my father and Susan. Indeed, there were more important things I should be doing now. I didn't need to do anything but wait. This was because my grandfather was very angry and was planning a small revenge against my father, intending to trick him. The house where my father and Susan live actually belongs to my grandfather. When my father married my mother, my grandfather provided the house to him but never asked for it back. Ultimately, the house would have become my father's upon my grandfather's death. My grandfather had never charged my father rent, but my father was supposed to cover the costs of any renovations to the house. The changes my grandfather made to the house were indeed dramatic and garnered enough attention. Then, my grandfather sent a message to the family group, telling me he was giving me the house as a wedding gift to support my new life. He had done the same for my father and said that considering I hadn't received enough support from my father, he would help me this time. I knew about my grandfather's scheme. However, what he continued to write was completely unexpected. The house that was supposed to be passed to my father, where he had been living but was legally still my grandfather's, was actually a gift for me. It was clear that my grandfather had been spiteful in doing this, and my father must understand that well. The problem is, I don't live in the same area as my father and have no plans to return. This is known among the family. While owning the house holds significant value for me, I have no plans to live there until at least retirement. For my father, who has lived in that house for many years, having it taken away would cause him significant damage and tarnish his reputation. While I had no sympathy for my father now that I actually hold the ownership, I understand how deeply hurt I would be if I were in his position. My father knew I had the power to take the house, evict him, demand rent, or do as I please. Of course, one cannot ignore the law, but realistically, it is well known how much authority the owner of a house has over a tenant. I can't predict how much of a reaction this will cause, but there is no doubt my father will be furious. While that is certain, I don't want to deal with unnecessary problems before my wedding. Whatever the reason my grandfather gave me the house, I had a heartfelt appreciation for his gift. I haven't decided exactly what to do about it yet, but I don't want to spend time on it now. With just a week left until the wedding, the family relations had completely fallen apart. I tried to distance myself from the trouble as much as possible, but it was unavoidable after my grandfather said he would give me the house. Despite trying to stay calm, I couldn't avoid getting involved. It turned into a big deal because my father likely didn't anticipate such a scenario. He called me several times, but I didn't answer because I could guess the content of the calls. Subsequently, he sent me messages trying to convince me to bring my grandfather to his senses, and even wrote that his way of raising me led to him becoming such a person who would betray his own family. I didn't respond to those messages and eventually blocked my father. Despite that, he tried to contact me through various means, even asking Susan to call me. She called once, but since I didn't respond, she didn't call again. Realizing other methods weren't working, he started sending me emails, which clearly conveyed his desperation. Ignoring his words continued, but seeing 5 emails every morning was mentally exhausting. It made me dread waking up, fearing what would await me. He was not invited to the wedding, but the thought of him showing up uninvited was increasingly worrying. I didn't want to see him at all. Honestly, I believe it would be best to keep a distance from Susan as well, as I was anxious she might cause some issues during the wedding. After the wedding, I called my grandfather and asked him to ensure this issue didn't affect me until I returned from my honeymoon. I didn't care what he did with the situation, but I wanted my honeymoon to remain undisturbed. I didn't want my most important day ruined by family problems anymore. My grandfather promised to ensure my father wouldn't do anything, and that I wouldn't receive any contact from them until after my honeymoon. I hoped nothing would happen, but I prepared to deal with it myself after I returned. There was a lot to be done, and I didn't have time to spend it on a father who had only used me for money. I had a happy marriage. Just a few days ago, Omar and I returned from a wonderful honeymoon. We had a great time alone, undisturbed by family. I believed no more troubles would arise, however I was painfully reminded that wasn't the case. When I returned, I didn't expect to face such a complicated situation. Yesterday, Julia called me, asking me to meet Susan. I honestly told her I didn't want to see Susan. The stress had been too much, and I had no choice but to uninvite Susan from the wedding. Julia said she understood my feelings. She mentioned that Susan felt the same but still wanted to meet once to clear everything up. Reluctantly, I decided to meet because I didn't want to disappoint Julia. She had no involvement in this matter, so I held no resentment towards her. She informed me that she was in my city with Susan and expressed a desire to meet soon. When I met Susan, it was initially awkward, but the conversation eventually flowed. She congratulated me on my marriage. I explained that I had to cancel her invitation because of my father's actions, and also because I suspected she might have been involved in the situation where they tried to take money from me, citing Julia's tuition and Emma's health issues as reasons. As soon as I mentioned this, Susan burst into tears and said she was unaware that my father had borrowed money from my grandfather. She then started to elaborate on what had happened. When she told me everything, I was overwhelmed by surprise and anger. It was true that Emma had been sick. There was no mistake about that part. My father had used some savings for the medical expenses, but it wasn't enough, so he told Susan he would borrow from my grandfather and promised her that he would definitely repay it. Susan said it was okay at that time. Afterward, she didn't ask him about the money again. When Emma recovered and the situation settled down, Susan was shocked to learn that my father had depleted Julia's money years ago and couldn't accept that fact. When she asked him about it, he simply explained that the money was used to repay my grandfather. Moreover, he explained that he was pressured by my grandfather at that time and had to use the money, and he told a sad story that I had offered to help with the tuition myself. Susan said that despite feeling very embarrassed about the situation, she was deeply grateful for my help. It seemed their marriage was going through a tough phase, requiring a lot of counseling and therapy. Everything started to fall apart when my grandfather told me he would give me the house and confessed he hadn't been repaid. Susan said it felt like someone had slapped her in the face. She asked my father where the money had gone. At first, my father tried to make excuses and lie, but he eventually admitted to having an affair and that the affair partner had threatened to tell Susan about it. The only way he could silence his affair partner was by paying her off. After that, he left the affair partner, and once the secret was exposed, his relationship with Susan completely ended. Since then, Susan has moved out, and they are proceeding with a divorce. She was approached by my father for reconciliation, but she emphasized that she could never forgive infidelity. During our conversation, I heard so many shocking revelations that I was left in disbelief. I didn't have the capacity to digest the facts. I was simply overwhelmed. I felt embarrassed for assuming that Susan had conspired with my father to steal money from me, especially since she too had been deceived by him. I encouraged her, and we both left the scene. Knowing the facts, I was able to reconcile with Susan. I deeply regret not inviting her to my wedding. She was completely innocent and, in fact, the most victimized person in this issue. Now, I was filled with anger and disgust. It still feels surreal that my father was a swindler and even cheated. He was truly the worst kind of person, and I no longer wanted anything to do with him. My current focus was to assist Susan and provide her with as much support as possible. Thus, I decided to charge rent to my father. Since he was still living in the same house, I told him that he needs to sign a formal lease if he wants to continue renting. The rent was set high, which will undoubtedly put him in a difficult situation, especially with the divorce underway, but it was his own doing. I've decided to split the rent between my mother and Susan. Susan has been a homemaker for so long that she now needs financial support and will likely receive a larger share. Meanwhile, my mother had worked all her life and wasn't in need of money. In fact, it was her idea to give all the money to Susan. We were not in dire need of additional income. We were satisfied with our lives and didn't need the extra money. However, Susan's situation was different, so I felt obligated to support her. She supported me while my father was absent. Even though I knew Susan would refuse the money, I insisted on giving it to her. When my father received the lease, he reacted very badly and tried to use other family members to retrieve the contract from me. Unfortunately for him, the entire family understood his issues and no longer wanted to be involved with him. He called and texted me, but I have ignored all communications while keeping a record of everything. Later, he tried to reach out through my grandfather, but my grandfather confronted him with reality. Since then, he has been quiet. He hasn't asked me to reconsider, which I believe means he understands that he can't expect more given the situation. Susan was aiming to gain full custody of Emma, but realistically, that seemed difficult at this point. Although my father was in a better position to provide financial support, proving his incompetence as a parent wasn't that easy. I don't know what will happen, but I sincerely hope that Emma can live with Susan. Susan is a wonderful mother, and I believe she will manage her relationship with Emma well. I can't say the same about her relationship with my father, but strangely enough, I can confidently say the exact opposite regarding Susan.